Open source software changed the world in countless amazing ways. From the Linux operating system, which is now the de facto standard for enterprise IT, to a whole host of operational solutions for business, open source is a durable movement. But how do developers of this technology get paid? Find out on this episode of Future Proof.
The future is here already. It's just not evenly distributed. Yet. Today's world teems with innovation. The nexus of hardware, software, and human ingenuity promises a revolution in possibilities. What does tomorrow look like? Witness Future Proof.
Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh here. And folks, I'm very excited to have a couple experts on the show today who are plying the trade that I find extremely valuable and is really an undercurrent of innovation in the tech space and has been for, 25 years, maybe a bit longer. And that is open source. So we're going to talk about open source advocacy and how important open source is for technology today. Obviously, Linux, old Linus Torvalds, he threw down the gauntlet, I guess, roughly 30 years ago, I think, to build out an operating system that was open source. Now, I've talked to various people over the years about the impetus for all that, and I'm told it's not exactly what I thought it was, but de facto, it became an alternative for dealing with the criticality of having a functional operating system. One that is not proprietary and thus owned by a particular brand. Think Microsoft with Windows. Linux, in fact, has become the de facto standard for enterprise technology for many years now, for 20 years. Linux has been accepted as the standard foundation. And what does open source mean? Basically, it means the source code is available for review. And typically, what happens in the world of programming is you will write an application in code and then you compile it for a certain operating system like Windows or the Mac OS or Android or Linux or Unix back in the days, for example. And if it's closed source, well, that means that you don't really know unless you're inside the organization and have access to it. You don't know what the code was. You just know how it's been compiled and what it does. So it's kind of like a cake that you get is the compilation. If you have open source, you know the recipe for the cake. If you don't, then you don't know the recipe. So it's good for lots of different things. It's good for being able to identify errors. Bad code goes away is one of the lines about open source that is pretty common. But there are lots of drawbacks too. You can just understand how if it's open source and you just put it out there, well, why would anyone want to pay you for it? And the short answer is that you see lots and lots of companies do this. Of course, Red Hat became very famous in hardening Linux. So RHEL, I think Red Hat Enterprise Linux is what that stands for. They will go and help you deploy this stuff, help you make sure it stays up and running, watch out for security hacks and patches and so forth. There are lots of reasons why you want a partner doing that. That's typically the business model is you'll have an open source version of something and then a enterprise grade version. So think Confluent with Kafka, for example. There are lots and lots. There's data stacks with Cassandra. This is not a new thing. MongoDB, of course, is another open source database technology. There's lots and lots of open source stuff out there, and it is foundational to how many things work. iPhones, for example, all have all sorts of open source technology in them. One of my aha moments, and I'll bring in Max Howell here in just a second from T. We have Timothy Lewis as well. But one of my aha moments was getting on an international flight, I guess probably like 10, 11 years ago, and just sitting in front of the screen where you watch the movies. They were doing an upgrade, and I saw the little Linux character there, and like the code is going past my screen. I'm like, oh, okay. So they're using Linux as the operating system for the in-flight entertainment system. It's great if you can use these open source tools, but who pays the open source developers? That's the key. And if you have a project that's important and it's underpinned by one person and that person decides they don't want to deal with it anymore, that's a problem. And we've actually seen that problem play out. So with that long-winded explanation, I'll bring in Max Howell from T. It's TEA.xyz online. And these folks are trying to build out a model to compensate the open source developers and to really, I guess, infuse some remuneration into the community and some payback for these people to encourage them to keep going. So with all that, Max Howell, welcome to DM Radio. Tell us a bit about T and your mission to bolster open source.
Yeah, so I've been in open source for more than 20 years at this point. I didn't think I was going to be a programmer when I was at school, but I did a chemistry degree and I didn't like it. I didn't like it a lot. Um, to the extent that I went home and I installed Linux on my home computer, and Linux at the time was pretty new. The idea of open source hadn't really grabbed anyone fully, but while I was playing around with it, I discovered that there was something about open source that really captivated me. So I started building apps and things, but it wasn't until like 2009 that I really became like an open source figurehead when I developed this package manager for macOS called Homebrew, which nowadays has got more than 50 million people using it on a day-to-day basis. It's
Hmm.
enormous in its scope and size. It's really one of the biggest open source projects that was ever produced. And on my journey making a homebrew and working on it and finding that I had to spend all my evenings and weekends working on it and then, catching lunch breaks and things. And taking time off, like I took time off from work. I'd save up money and quit in order to work on homebrew full time because that's what I wanted to do. And I think this is often the case with open source developers is that what they really want to do is build this open source, and the open source they build often becomes like key parts of all modern digital infrastructure, powers the world. And yet, there's something about the open source model that's always made it so that it's unlikely that you're going to be able to get paid for working on it. Like,
Hmm.
we were never the kinds of people who expected to get paid. Uh, like we did it because it seemed like a fun thing to do, and then it became very important to an awful lot of people, and then we sort of felt half trapped, half like super passionate about what we were doing, to the extent that we kept making sure it worked. But there is something awfully wrong with the fact that so much of the world's digital infrastructure nowadays runs on open source, and yet it's very rare that you'll meet someone who can work on open source full time.
Hmm.
They're trading other parts of their lives in order to work on this stuff. And that often leads to issues where, the security of the open source they're working on is like an afterthought, which is not a great thing considering how much of the world runs on this stuff. And as you said, like often these people just rage quit suddenly, and every few months you see a story from someone saying, "Look, I've been begging for these companies. They're often very big companies that build on top of this stuff to help me to work on this, and I give up. I'm done." And that leaves massive holes in an industry that ever more is in a position where security problems can affect billions of people. So yeah, we've been trying to build out a solution, something new, something different to the existing attempts, and yeah, we're very excited about what we're building.
Yeah, let's kind of dive into that because there are some alternatives. I mean, you're not the first folks to have this idea, but obviously you've got enough experience to know where rubber meets road, and it is important that we maintain these projects. I won't tell which story it was. I'd have to look it up honestly, but there's a story from a webinar I watched a couple years ago where a very critical component of many enterprise technology stacks was just no longer going to be supported. And there was a guy like feverishly communicating with the developer, say, please, would you just, hand over the project and we'll take it from here. And it was like, nah, leave me alone, go away. And it crashed and burned. And then, it's just like having a part of your car that all of a sudden stops working and you can't replace it. It's like, well, what do you do then? Like, it's a very, very challenging situation. And a lot of people don't realize that these technology stacks for large enterprises are extremely complex. They've spent years in many cases really trying to hammer it out and get it to where it's durable and agile and can do all the things it can do. And you pull a piece out of that thing, it's like a Jenga game, right? Like, oh no, the blocks just start falling. So what are you doing in your approach that you think is going to ensure success?
Yeah, well, we feel that a big part of these withdrawals is, the lack of funding for
Hmm.
people that they would work on these things full time if there was a system that allowed them to do so. Over the years, people have tried to make ways for that to work. Like one of the ways that has emerged over the last few years is the idea of commercial open source, pioneered like by Red Hat probably, like way back.
Hmm.
If you can figure out how to build some kind of service on top of the open source, then you can probably charge companies for that. I think a lot of open source devs don't really want that, is the truth. They want to work on open source in the way that open source works. They don't want to figure out how to bolt on some sort of service model, hire a team, manage a team. They're just builders that want to continue this opportunity to build. So
Hmm.
it doesn't fit for like 95%. And some of those 5% nowadays are like these venture funded kind of models where it's kind of open source, like companies like Superbase and Vercells, like it's kind of open source. I'd even put like stuff like React in there, which, powers a huge number of websites nowadays. Like the,
Sure.
the truth is, the companies that are behind these things have agendas, and agenda does not fit into open source in my mind. Like
Mm.
open source is about building something that solves a problem, and then the community goes, "Yeah, this solves my problem. I like
Yep.
this. I'm going to
Yep.
work with this. I'm going to build this into my stack. I'm going to contribute to this." Open source is weird. This is the reason that nobody's really figured out a way to fund it, and that's
Right.
why our approach is really different. Like we're taking this approach using cryptocurrencies because cryptocurrencies allow you to change the economics of a situation. So we've spent an awful lot of time now, like figuring out how to apply smart contracts on top of open source in order to make it so that the whole system sustains itself in a way that doesn't really change how open source has evolved.
Hmm.
Like it wouldn't be any good at all if we changed how open source works. Like we wouldn't be doing the world a service, and also it probably wouldn't work. Like open source would just go, nah, that doesn't work for us. Like, yeah, I'd love to get paid, but like by being paid, you're making it so that actually this is different. So nah, not interested in that. And I'm sure Tim can talk more about how we're going to go about that.
Yeah, Tim, why don't you chime in and let us know? Because again, I see the challenge that you're facing, and I think Max did an excellent job of describing open source developers. They want to build things. They want to build things. Yes, they want to get paid, but mostly they want to build, and they don't want to be hindered or held back in how to build and what to do. And typically you don't like a set of rules being thrown at you, right? You just want to get stuff done. So, what's your take on how TEA.xyz can solve for this challenge?
Yeah, so this was a problem now that we've worked on for the last, 3.5 years directly, but it really stemmed from, me getting to know Max. I've been a developer and engineer my whole life. I met Max in 2013. I had just been getting into Bitcoin and Doge and then Ethereum network. Max is an amazing developer. And his project at the time was the number one project on GitHub and had been for 3 years.
Hmm.
Yet he had to go from contract to contract in different jobs to support his ability to go work on these platforms. And it took several cycles in the way that crypto evolved to be able to even have conversations with him about where there might be solutions. So I myself, I've worked in the financial industry, had worked in the financial industry for a long time, data expediency and understanding like the underpinnings of fixed protocol data transfer and security. So no stranger to cryptography. I've been using cryptography for 30 plus years. And as these networks have evolved, they're becoming more functional. Max, like many others, I think for a long time, just saw crypto as you know, dog tokens and memes and nothing of any substance. But ideally, we're building out systems that are really this world compute or shared registry type of platforms that people can hopefully ascribe better supply chain security to, for example. But if we attach things like token economic theory on top of these, we believe that you can generate and create real value off of the community values that have already been established within open source. So as Max mentioned, trying not to pervert the way that open source functions and trying not to have any systems that are tit for tat or requiring people to pay token to be able to access open source, but allowing people to be able to be rewarded through a protocol itself. It took us a long time to develop a couple of the different parts. One of the parts that we really have worked on hard is trying to value open source. Not all open source is valuable. It is under our estimations, probably the top 10% of open source has any value.
Mm,
And so trying to identify what's important and what's used has been very, very difficult because the communities that have evolved are separate, and there's no real way to tell any longer from stars or downloads from GitHub what is actually used. All of those things can
mm,
be faked. All those things can be not real, not genuine. So the first thing that we set out to do was create a platform that can really understand the value of open source. We created this protocol called Chai. Really, what it does is it attaches to all the different package manager ecosystems and creates a global dependency graph. So really, we
wow.
put different weights on what's depended on by what. And the system package managers have a lot more importance than, say, the language package managers, right? So understanding that history of weight, if your dependency is depended upon by something that is, truly established and has a larger weight to it, you can rise in what we call T rank. We consider T rank something that's similar to page rank, but for open source dependencies. Based on that T rank, we can distribute rewards from the network itself. So
Mm,
these networks, since they've evolved over the last 15 years, there's an enormous use for the different types of compute that you can have on them, not only from the DeFi-like contracts, but moving into other data availability contracts, moving into other registry contracts, moving into communication gates that we think can be utilized as the user experience gets better for these types of on-chain mechanisms. So I feel like we both felt like a majority of open source developers, hadn't taken a look into these networks. Many of them felt like they got left behind. They didn't participate in the Ethereum launch. They didn't participate in, earlier launches of popular networks. So what we wanted to do was create a network that one would marry some of the tools that they might be used to. We created ultimately a layer 2 Ethereum network that has a custom precompile that allows us to use the GPG address space. So
mm,
going back to GPG PKI, which has been used in Git since 2005, it allows us to not only be able to distribute value to those that have committed to open source over the last 20 years,
mm,
but also have them use GPG as a part of the PKI to launch contracts and be able to execute commands in the system that's not a far step away from their normal dev UX.
yeah.
So then the network itself, as it gains in popularity and uses, is a permissionless network. And the way that it's structured through the fees that the network generates, a large majority of those fees go directly back into rewarding those that have registered their packages within our platform.
Your host here, Eric Kavanaugh, with Timothy Lewis and Max Howell of Tea. That's like the drink, tea, TEA.xyz. But they are building out a rather robust solution to help foster productive open source development and help remunerate the people who build out open source code. Because as we've discussed and as is pretty well known in the industry, building open source technologies does not necessarily pay well. And there are all sorts of strategies around how to make money from that sort of thing. Typically, there is a company that sits on top of an open source project, like Red Hat does with Linux or DataStax does with Cassandra. There are lots of examples, Confluent with Kafka, many examples out there. But at the end of the day, do the developers really get rewarded for what they do? And do we understand the dependencies? And that's what caught my attention, Tim, just a moment ago, as you talked about having this model built of dependencies of different packages and where they are brought together and what those stacks look like and who's dependent on which piece of technology and who runs it. So this model that you built out, it's tracking specific open source projects and where we believe they are deployed. Is that the kind of thing you've got built here?
Well, it's tracking all open source from all different package managers that exist. Our goal is to have
Wow.
the 35 plus package managers over the initial launch. Right now, we're covering the top 10 or so to be able to evaluate and create this global dependency graph that we're doing. But ultimately, we're going to be able to reward those that have decided to participate and register or not. we can use signed commits from GPG signatures to reward developers and ecosystems that may or may not want to register their package yet within our ecosystem. Trying to get the messaging to them that they've been rewarded is another issue, since they had never used that really for any reward distribution prior. But we think we have a unique way of not only identifying the importance of dependencies, but then also making sure that the protocol itself is rewarding those dependencies without grants or bounties. And we will have those sorts of things. We think those sorts of things are important for different aspects. But the general function and use of the network itself and the transactions that occur on the network itself, whomever builds them, whether they're a developer that's utilizing and strong in Web3 on-chain applications, or a developer that published some amazing dependency back in 2007, and is one of those that underpin a lot of the current technology stack, they can be rewarded on our system.
That's very interesting. So it's underpinned by Ethereum. Is that what I'm hearing correctly? So you got a blockchain at the foundation. That's very valuable because blockchain is immutable, and that's the whole idea, is that your code would be registered on the blockchain. Here is the string of text that was deployed, and in this open source project, it's now been packaged up by various people. It's being used around the world. A lot of that information is available, and then you have some capacity to understand the value that's being provided, and you're ideally allocating that according to how much work someone has done and how much people depend on them on their particular piece of code. Because the key is you have to keep things updated, right? I mean, the environment keeps changing, and because the environment keeps changing, you have to keep changing the applications that you're running in these organizations. Needs change, concurrency use goes higher, different things happen, and so you have to be constantly tinkering away with all this stuff. But like, how well built out is this thing so far? Like, what are you able to identify? And I guess, how do you determine the value is a big question.
Yeah, so we've had our Chai algorithm and protocol running for over a year now. We had a test network deployment of that started last April on the base network. And during that time, we had a large amount of users. We had over 1.7 million uniquely registered wallets, about 610,000 people
Wow.
registered with their GitHub, and over 16,000 packages that were registered. A
Hmm.
large amount of that, we've been, attacked, bot attacked, farm attacked. There's anytime you're trying to do something like this, especially on a test network with no financial repercussions, people come at it hard, trying to earn rewards. But it taught us a lot of lessons,
Hmm.
and so we've come back with some revisions to Chai protocol that we're deploying actually this week, publicly, that we're very excited for, that we think of that are going to take care of a lot of the problems that we faced before. And this will be completely, an evolving process. But it's really about reducing spam, reducing the Sybil attacks that go on the value distribution for the
Hmm.
network. And again, doing this in public. So we open sourced Chai about 4 months ago. We've had a number of different contributions there, but as it grows, we expect the visibility of that to rise, and we hope that more people will come across and help us figure out better methods to make sure that the weighting and the value that we have for the distribution is more accurate. There's many other kind of problems we're trying to solve, but if we can attack this at the root and understand really the value of the dependencies, then the things on top as well can be solved.
So is the business model where organizations that are using open source software would pay for some kind of license or for access to your system, for example, to be able to gauge the dependencies in their stack and then get help when there are problems? I mean, are those the clients that pay into the pool, which then eventually goes out to the developers? Is that how it works?
So the best part about on-chain and Web3 and these networks, because we've built a blockchain on top of a blockchain, right? So in our
Hmm.
blockchain, really the value comes from Metcalfe's, the network theory. So
Hmm.
the more users of a network, the more valuable it becomes because there's the underlying utility cost. And
Hmm.
our network is powered by T itself. So ultimately, the more people that we have building permissionlessly, utilizing some of the tools and some of the contracts that we're implementing, the more value is generated and the more is the need for the utility is greater. There will be things like distributing value, we think, in a fairer method, being able to distribute to, being able to understand what open source you use, say in your container or your enterprise environment, and then be able to distribute value to a tree of all the things, and not only the projects that you know of, but their dependencies and their dependencies, which we think will be very valuable for enterprise
Hmm.
donation. But there will be other businesses built on top of it. And that we imagine communication gating. We imagine that there might be different sorts of license mechanisms. We think that this is going to be a fantastic system for supply chain security, and
Hmm.
being able to understand the underlying assets and be able to depend on them, knowing that they're being funded reliably.
Yeah, see, that's a really, really interesting point you just made, and maybe we'll bring Max back in to comment on this. I'd mentioned I watched a webinar a couple of years ago from the folks at Tidelift, and the guy made a really, really interesting observation. He said, if you ask coders to describe themselves, most would not use the term supplier, but they really are suppliers and they're part of a supply chain. This is a very long chain that has tremendous implications for running critical infrastructure all around the world. So in many ways, coders are, especially open source coders, project managers are suppliers in a supply chain, even if they don't kind of view themselves that way. I thought that was a very powerful observation that he made. And as I talk to you guys, I'm realizing that the depth of complexity necessary to achieve what you're trying to build, which is truly remarkable, and it is bulletproof, and that's the idea. It has to be bulletproof if it's really going to work. But what do you think about that supply chain analogy and how it kind of plays into what's really happening here?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, and I think the truth is a lot of open source devs do not consider themselves part of the supply chain and would
Right.
rather they weren't, right? They just want to make cool stuff, and like they love that other people think their stuff's cool and are using it and then giving them feedback, and they dislike it when they get angry bug reports and things like that. And part of this is because they aren't getting paid, right?
Right.
Like, it kind of makes it so they don't have to really care. They don't
That's a
really
good
have to
point.
care if there's massive
Right.
security problems. Like they'd rather not, right? They're embarrassed
That's
about the
funny.
massive security problem. Like they're ashamed that their software had this bug that was problematic. But do they care if you've lost money? Nah. So part of that's just like a lack of responsibility that comes from not getting paid. So, we're building a valuable system that has utility that generates value inside of it, and then we're distributing part of that value to the open source devs.
Hmm.
They'll get some sense of obligation because of that, which makes them feel like they are part of this supply chain. And yeah, they don't have to do it, right? Maybe some of them will choose not to, right? They're fine with the situation as it is right now. But a lot of these 10% of projects that Tim was talking about that power so much of the world, they're kind of itching to get more flow coming in
Mm-hmm.
so that they can care more about their impact, so they can
Mm-hmm.
concentrate on security issues and bugs, on features,
Mm-hmm.
making sure that they have a wider distribution. And they're struggling to a large extent. Even huge projects like Python, right? They get funding from like lots of different companies. It's not enough. It's never enough. Like Airbnb donates something like 100 grand a year, and they're one of the biggest
Wow.
companies for donations to open source. And Airbnb make like $1 for every 1,500 bucks made worldwide. I think that was the stat last year or the year before
Hmm.
that released. Um, it the way the system works currently doesn't encourage enough of that to go back. So
Right.
with what we're doing, we're hoping that not only does it like fix this injustice, which it's an injustice. It's not something, as I said, like none of us ever started open source in order to become rich. Like that wasn't why we did it. Like we don't expect like to make money with it. That we never did at least.